A 5 elixir mosquito bite. That is all Goblin Hut was. Weak, annoying, a waste of elixir. Just a spawner that chipped away and slowly drove you insane. It wasn't feared, it wasn't respected, but it was patient, slowly waiting, watching, hoping. Until finally, after years of humiliation, it happened. One rework, one buff. And suddenly, Goblin Hut wasn't a joke anymore. It was the card no one saw coming. This is the story of Clash Royale's most misunderstood building. A card designed to fail, but determined to fight back. When Clash Royale first launched into beta on January 4th, 2016, there were no champions, no seasons, no fancy mechanics, just a simple, chaotic game trying to figure itself out, and tucked inside of that small pool of cards was the Goblin Hut. A 5 elixir building that, at the time, served one purpose: to slowly, endlessly flood the arena with spear goblins. Back then, Goblin Hut wasn't the defensive card we think of today. It was meant to counter win conditions or help you hold the line. Its job was simple: sit there, spam out goblins, and force your opponent to constantly react. In theory, it sounds harmless. In practice, it makes matches miserable. The Goblin Hut also seems to resemble some of the small buildings in the Clash of Clans single-player campaign. Here's its sample building that is just there to get destroyed. It deals no damage and definitely doesn't spawn anything. In Clash Royale, though, the Goblin Hut didn't dominate the top ladder during beta. It sat at around a 17% usage rate, average for the time, especially considering how small the card pool was. But numbers don't tell the whole story, because when you did see it, you knew exactly what kind of match you were in for. The strategy was always the same: drop a hut, wait, drop another hut, usually Barbarian Hut, because why not double the annoyance? And from there, just keep placing spawners and letting the swarm build up. The person using the hut didn't have to do much. They could sit back, collect elixir, and watch as their opponent burned through cards trying to stop the tide of goblins and barbarians crawling towards their towers. For new players, which, let's be real, everyone was during the beta, the Goblin Hut was especially appealing. It didn't require precise timing. You didn't need to know card interactions. You could just drop it and let the game play itself for a while. That made it perfect for players still learning the ropes, but it also made it infuriating to face. Because for the person on the other side, every match against spawner decks felt like a chore. You couldn't just place your win condition and go for a clean push. You had to constantly defend, constantly manage elixir, and constantly try to clear swarms, knowing that the moment you stopped, the goblins would start chipping your tower down bit by bit. And the worst part, there weren't many good tools to stop it. There was no firecracker, no e-dragon, no cheap splash troops. Your best bet, a 5 elixir wizard. If you got sniped by a spear goblin or zapped by something else, you were straight back where you started. It didn't take long for players to get sick of it, and you know what I'm sick of? Seeing that you're not subscribed to this channel. Seriously though, these videos do take an incredible amount of effort, and your support means the world to me. I really appreciate it. Alright, the Goblin Hut wasn't overpowered. It wasn't winning tournaments or topping leaderboards, but it did slow down games. Matches against spawner decks dragged on forever. You'd see players drop a Goblin Hut, then a Barb Hut, then maybe a Tombstone for good measure. And the entire match would devolve into a slow, grindy battle of attrition. And that went directly against what Supercell wanted Clash Royale to be. From the very start, they made it clear: this is a game about offense. Clash Royale was supposed to reward smart timing, well-planned pushes, and pressure, not passive play where you could sit back and let buildings do the work for you. That's why, even during the beta, Supercell started nudging the game away from spawner spam. One of the earliest changes was a nerf to spear goblins' sight range, not aimed specifically at Goblin Hut, but enough to make spawner decks a little easier to deal with. And as players got better at the game, the Goblin Hut's appeal started to fade. What felt powerful in week 1, flooding the map with goblins, didn't hold up once people learned to manage their elixir and counter swarms more effectively. Its usage dropped fast, from an average of 17 down to around 6% by the end of beta. But that early impression stuck. Goblin Hut became one of the first cards players hated facing, not because it was strong, but because it made the game feel slower, grindier, and a lot less fun. It was a card designed to chip away at your towers, but in beta, it mostly chipped away at your patience. As Clash Royale moved out of its beta chaos and into early 2016, players were quickly learning the ropes. The Goblin Hut, once a steady source of spear goblins and annoying chip damage, began to lose traction, especially in the top tiers of play. Among newer players and mid-ladder, the Goblin Hut still found some love. It was easy to use, required little timing and skill, and fit well into the spawner archetype that many casual players favored. The constant pressure of goblins slowly whittling away at towers could frustrate opponents who weren't ready to deal with it. However, as the player base grew stronger and more competitive, the Hut's effectiveness dropped sharply. By early May 2016, Goblin Hut's usage rate in top ladder hit 0%, vanishing from the highest competitive levels almost entirely. Why? A major factor was the rise of the Royal Giant, who received a significant range buff in this period. His usage skyrocketed from almost nothing to nearly 28% in top ladder. With this increased range, Royal Giant could target buildings like the Goblin Hut from a safe distance, shutting down its slow spawner strategy. And while it's unlikely Royal Giant alone caused the Goblin Hut's downfall, his presence definitely made life harder for passive spawner decks. At the same time, newer splash damage cards like the Princess gave players efficient, cheap ways to clear goblin swarms, further reducing the Goblin Hut's impact. The meta itself was evolving really fast, shifting toward quicker, more aggressive gameplay, which fit Supercell's version of Clash Royale as a game rewarding offense, timing, and pressure over stall tactics. Though Goblin Hut disappeared from top ladder, it still remained somewhat popular in mid and lower ladder for a bit longer. Casual players still leaned on it, likely because it was easy to play and required less precise strategy. But even there, its presence was slowly fading as players learned better counters.
Powered, and they just keep in dropping all these goblins, and they just end up swarming all of my towers. So you can see that Giant is heading towards my main tower, probably going to take it out. We have 10 seconds remaining until overtime. Is he going to take it out before overtime? It looks like he might be able to. Look at all those goblins. Those goblins just got destroyed by my fireball. Now there's 60 seconds of extra time. So let's go ahead and see if this guy can take out 200 more hit points on my main tower. I'm sending in the skeletons. I'm trying to, counter everything I can, but unfortunately it's not going to be enough.
Importantly, Goblin Hut did not receive any direct balance changes or nerfs during this early post-beta period. Its decline wasn't forced by patches, but was a neutral result of evolving metas and player skill. By mid-2016, Goblin Hut was already on its way to becoming a forgotten relic of Clash Royale's early days, a card that once annoyed many but now struggled to find a place in the fast-paced game that was taking shape. And by the end of July, the Goblin Hut was already losing ground. What was once a somewhat reliable source of chip damage and pressure had steadily become less and less relevant in the fast-evolving Clash Royale meta. Usage numbers told the story pretty clearly. The card's presence in top ladder was shrinking week by week. From hovering in the low single digits, somewhere between 1 and 4% usage rate, the Goblin Hut's numbers continued to decline as players discovered faster, more efficient strategies. And by the end of July of 2016, it had completely vanished from competitive play, hitting a crushing 0% usage rate in top ladder. The Goblin was, for all intents and purposes, forgotten. But why? Why did it fall so hard? And why were other buildings better? Well, to answer that, we need to look at how buildings settled into clear roles by this point in Clash Royale's evolution. So on one side, you had defensive buildings like Tesla, Cannon, Bomb Tower, and Inferno Tower. These structures provided consistent, reliable defense. They were designed to soak up damage, clear enemy troops efficiently, or focus down key threats like tanks. Their role was straightforward and vital to many defensive strategies. Opposite them stood the offensive buildings, the Mortar and Expo. These were win condition cards that directly pressured the opponent's towers, often shaping the flow of the game by forcing responses and controlling the battlefield. They were integral to decks focused on sustained chip damage and siege tactics. They were the spawner buildings, the Goblin Hut, Barbarian, and Tombstone. The Tombstone actually falls in the defensive building category as the skeletons distract things like Prince, and the Tombstone can pull in giants and hog riders before breaking and unleashing a mini skeleton army. The Tombstone was never really used for offensive playstyles, and the Goblin Hut and Barbarian Hut These buildings had a bit of a unique niche, slowly and continuously spawning troops to overwhelm opponents with sheer numbers over time. This strategy relied on attrition and sustained pressure rather than burst damage or control. However, the meta had drastically shifted away from spawner decks. Players increasingly favored faster, more aggressive playstyles that prioritized quick cycle decks and immediate impact. Spawner buildings, slow to generate troops and passive by nature, felt clunky and outdated. The Goblin Hut's 5 elixir cost made it particularly a heavy investment for a card that only dealt a tiny bit of damage gradually. It lacked the instant defensive value of the Tesla or the offensive threat of the mortar. It wasn't versatile or impactful enough to justify its hefty cost. Worse yet, decks usually only include one building at most. The only notable exception was the Expo combined with the Tesla, so it wasn't just the Goblin Hut. The Goblin Hut's natural partner, the Barbarian Hut, also sunk to a 0% usage rate, which meant the Goblin Hut wouldn't do well regardless. The only time it ever saw any success was its synergy with the Barbarian Hut, and because of this, the Goblin Hut found itself in an awkward position. It simply didn't fit well into most decks. Outside of the now nearly obsolete spawner archetype, there was no viable home for it. This big ol' smoothie of high cost, slow, and limited impact, poor synergy, and an evolving meta that punished passive playstyles meant the Goblin Hut was a card stuck in limbo. Too clunky to compete and too niche to adapt. So now it is the end of 2016 and the Goblin Hut sits at a pathetic 0% usage rate, a card that once flooded the arena with goblins, completely forgotten. Outpaced by a game that had moved on without it. Slow, clunky, and a relic that no one wanted in their deck. But don't think this is where our story ends. Keep watching, because the Goblin Hut's fall was only the beginning. And what happens next? That's something you don't want to miss. Unfortunately, through most of 2017, the Goblin Hut drifted further into irrelevance. As the months ticked by, it became one of the least used cards in Clash Royale, a building that had once been annoying to face, now almost forgotten. Top players ignored it entirely, and even casuals were starting to move on. But finally, after over a year of no direct attention, the Hut got a balance change. On April 19th, 2017, Supercell gave the Goblin Hut a small 5% hit point buff. Now, on the surface, this adjustment was meant to help the building stick around longer, to give it a bit more defensive value and perhaps nudge it back into viability, but in practice, it barely moved the needle. The Goblin Hut's issue wasn't just its durability, it was its identity. The Hut didn't offer fast or threatening value on the field. A few more hit points didn't change the fact that it was too slow to contribute and easy to ignore or outpace. Top ladder players didn't suddenly start slotting it into their decks, and its use rate stayed close to 0. So if small buffs like this wouldn't do much, why was it so hard to bring the Hut back? Part of the problem had nothing to do with the building itself, and everything to do with the troops that it produced. Spear Goblins, one of the most popular and reliable cards in the game, had long since fallen out of favor. Their damage was too low, their threat was too small, and they could be taken out by nearly everything, including the popular Zap and Log. By 2017, they sat at 0% usage rate in top ladder, and yet the Goblin Gang, a card that combined both goblins and spear goblins, was absolutely everywhere, with a staggering 44% usage rate at its peak. It created what you would call a triangular problem. The Goblin Gang was strong, but it was made up of 2 weak components, goblins and spear goblins. If Supercell tried to buff either troop individually, Goblin Gang would become overpowered. That's why balancing these cards became such a headache, and it's actually part of the reason why future cards like Rascals were designed as brand new units rather than combinations of existing troops, so they could be adjusted without creating this kind of balancing nightmare. So Supercell had their hands tied. They couldn't buff the troops without breaking the gang, and if they buffed the Hut too much, say increasing the spawn rate or total lifetime, they risked indirectly making spear goblins stronger, which could ripple into unwanted territory. The 5% HP buff was a safe, conservative choice, but it did nothing to address the real issues. In truth, it wasn't more health the Hut needed. It needed a clearer purpose in a game that was all about speed, pressure, and value. And players noticed. In the community, on Reddit, forums, and balanced feedback threads, people have been begging for something more meaningful. Whenever usage rate snapshots were posted, the same comments kept appearing. How could they buff Goblin Hut properly. Goblin Hut needs a real buff. It's been 20 snapshots since it's had more than 0% usage rate. But Supercell stayed cautious. They didn't want to overcorrect and create a new problem, especially with cards like Goblin Gang still shaping the meta. The Goblin Hut's fortunes stayed the same through the summer and fall. Even after the Goblin Gang finally got nerfed in July of 2017, Spear Goblins and the Hut didn't return. And even after Supercell directly buffed Spear Goblins in October of 2017, increasing their hit speed from 1.3 to 1.1, a pretty significant change, it barely registered in top ladder play. The game had moved on. Players simply didn't want slow spawners when faster, more flexible options were available. But then came December of 2017, and with it, the first and only moment that year when the Goblin Hut was truly relevant yet again. Out of nowhere, the Hut showed up on the biggest stage in Clash Royale, the Crown Championship World Finals. Suddenly, pro players were slotting it into decks built around Mega Knight and P.E.K.K.A, using it to control lanes, apply slow pressure, and back up their big tanks. There was also a new tool that helped out, the Royal Ghost, which had just been released. The Royal Ghost created new synergies, forcing opponents to play differently, and the Goblin Hut could quietly generate value behind the chaos. Even Miner saw use alongside the Hut, tanking for Spear Goblins and creating dangerous split lane pressure that was tricky to answer cleanly. The results were immediate. Goblin Hut's use rate shot up from 1% to 15% in top ladder almost overnight. So why? What crazy buff had been given to the Goblin Hut? Well, I mean, there really wasn't a buff. Top players just found new synergies and they were able to make a seemingly useless card relevant yet again. And so for a brief, strange moment, it became the most popular building in the game, all because of this one dominant deck. The deck that didn't just find success, it overtook Logbait, which had been the most popular deck for the past few months by far. Players were stunned after months of calling for a buff and getting nothing but small, irrelevant tweaks. The Goblin Hut had finally risen, not because of any direct change, but because the meta around it had shifted just enough for it to thrive. Except it didn't really. The very next month, the Goblin Hut had already dropped to a sad 3% usage. It instantly got nerfed after its success the previous month. As 2018 dawned, the Goblin Hut was still lingering in memory as that card from the brief Mega Knight Royal Ghost meta at the end of 2018. It had been part of the most popular deck in the game at the time, paired with heavy hitters to form a slow, smothering push. But the magic didn't last. Supercell moved fast to stop the Hut from running wild. In January of 2018, they hit it with a subtle nerf. The spawn interval of the Spear Goblins was increased ever so slightly. On paper, this just meant one fewer goblin spawned over the Hut's lifetime. That sounds small, almost meaningless, but for a spawner which relies on steady, long-term pressure, losing even a single goblin per cycle would make it significantly less valuable. And so with that tiny adjustment, Goblin Hut fell off a cliff at top ladder. Usage rates tanked to around 3% within weeks, and meanwhile Royal Ghost, the true star of that oppressive meta, got his own nerfs, and without him enabling the Goblin Hut to thrive, the spawners simply didn't have a place anymore. But the Goblin Hut wasn't gone everywhere. In casual ladder, it held on. Spawner decks had always appealed to newer or less competitive players. They felt safe. You didn't need quick reflexes, complex micro, or precise cycling. You just needed to place your Hut, wait, and let the goblins chip away. It was passive pressure that forced your opponent to act, or at least that's how it felt. But at the higher levels of play, this approach no longer worked. The game was speeding up. Players were cycling faster, punishing overcommitments, and learning how to efficiently clear out swarms without overinvesting. Spawner decks, once a reliable crutch, now felt clunky and outdated. The Goblin Hut struggles weren't just about its own stats. The real problem was systemic. Spawner buildings as a whole were starting to look like relics of an earlier Clash Royale, a slower, grindier Clash Royale. By this point, buildings generally fell into clear categories. Defensive buildings, Cannon, Tesla, Bomb Tower, Inferno Tower, designed to protect your towers and stop win conditions. Offensive buildings like Expo and Mortar, win conditions themselves, built to pressure and force responses. And finally, spawners, Goblin Hut, Barbarian Hut, and Furnace, the awkward middle. They didn't really threaten towers directly, but they didn't offer immediate defense. They just spawned things, as a spawner does. The problem is that middle ground didn't fit anymore. The meta had evolved, games were faster, pressure was applied through quick pushes, cheap cycles, and high damage interactions. There was little room for a slow, gradual win condition like Goblin Hut. Supercell wasn't blind to the Hut's struggles, but fixing it wasn't easy because of what Goblin Hut represented in the game's ecosystem. Its core troop, the Spear Goblin, appeared in multiple cards, and those cards were causing their own headaches. By 2018, Goblin Gang had become the go-to swarm card. It packed both regular goblins and spear goblins for some excellent value, and it was central to many popular decks. If Supercell buffed spear goblins directly, they risked breaking Goblin Gang. That left Goblin Hut in a bit of an awkward spot. This is exactly why, in card design after Goblin Gang, Supercell deliberately avoided reusing existing troops together in this way. Seriously, we talked about the Rascals earlier, but honestly a smart design choice by Supercell for once. So Goblin Hut was stuck. Supercell tried some slight adjustments. In April, a minor hit speed nerf to Spear Goblins, targeting Goblin Gang more than the Hut, and in mid-2018, a bigger rework to Spear Goblins. Slower hit speed but higher damage so they could one-shot skeletons and also kill minions faster. To prevent Goblin Hut from becoming oppressive with these stronger goblins, they cut its lifetime, removing 2 whole waves of goblins. So, with the reworked goblins in the Hut, the result was it was weaker than ever. Every so often a change or mode would give Goblin Hut a flicker of relevance. The Rage challenge, where spawn intervals were sped up, made spawners more powerful, but nothing close to this in Top Ladder. Later that year, Supercell gave Goblin Hut another small buff, reducing the spawn interval so that 1 more Spear Goblin would appear over its lifetime. Combined with the previous damage buffs, this meant Goblin Hut could now deal more tower chip damage if left alone than ever before, but nobody ever left it alone. Competitive players knew how to handle it. It wasn't long before Goblin Hut sank back to the bottom of usage charts, stuck at 1% and oftentimes even 0% at Top Ladder. 2019 brought even more attempts to revive this card. In April, Supercell reduced the spawn interval again, trying to restore Goblin Hut's value as a swarm generator. For a brief moment, players experimented. Hut found its way into some P.E.K.K.A control decks and minor chip decks, but the experimentation ended fast. Goblin Hut still didn't offer what modern decks needed. Its slow value generation was too easy to punish, too clunky in a world full of fast cycle and precision defense. Supercell even ran a community poll asking which underperforming card deserved help. Goblin Hut was an option, almost nobody picked it. The player base had moved on, and yet Supercell, they hadn't really given up. Beneath the surface, they were cooking up a rework, one final attempt to give the Goblin Hut a new identity. But that, of course, is a story for 2020. After years of limbo, the Goblin Hut finally got a fresh breath of life in April of 2020. This wasn't coming out of nowhere. Just a couple months earlier in February, the Barbarian Hut had undergone a rework that made it spawn barbarians continuously until its timer expired. That change helped stabilize Barbarian Hut as a solid, balanced card. Naturally, Supercell figured the Goblin Hut deserved a similar treatment. The plan? Add a little extra punch on death. Now when the Goblin Hut was destroyed, it would immediately spawn 3 Spear Goblins, and to keep things fair, the building's lifetime was cut by 10 seconds, meaning the total number of goblins spawned over its lifetime stayed roughly the same. On paper, this looked like a clean, reasonable update, something that might bring Goblin Hut back to life without breaking the game. But nobody expected what came next. This modest tweak exploded into something much bigger. The guaranteed 3 Spear Goblins on destruction changed everything. No longer could opponents deny the Hut's value by lightning or rocketing it immediately. Those goblins were guaranteed. The Hut became an ironclad defensive nightmare that also carried surprising offensive potential. Suddenly, it wasn't just a spawner, it was a versatile tool that fit into decks ranging from Graveyard and Minor Control to Lava Hound, Elixir Golem, and even Mega Knight Bait. For a 5 Elixir building, that was insane versatility and value. But the player reaction? pretty brutal. The community was already wary of spawners after Barbarian Hut's own rise. They didn't want the meta dominated by slow, defensive swarm buildings anymore. Goblin Hut's sudden power spike was met with frustration and calls to keep spawners weak, if not outright banished. Balance wasn't enough. Players wanted these bulky spawner cards gone from the meta entirely. Supercell had no choice but to respond fast and hard. In the May 2020 balance changes, just weeks after the rework, Goblin Hut was hit with a massive 35% HP nerf. Before, it would survive a rocket hit cleanly. Now, it couldn't even take a lightning strike. But here's the kicker. If you struck the hut immediately with lightning, you still got the 3 spear goblins from its death effect. That nuance meant it retained some offensive bite even when becoming much easier to kill. So why the drastic nerf? Partly because Earthquake was also being reworked to hit buildings less hard, and Supercell wanted to keep it a strong counter against spawners. The impact was immediate and brutal. Goblin Hut once again found itself on the scrap heap. Usage and viability tanked. The card was back to square one, stuck in that awkward space where spawners were either irrelevant or oppressive, with no healthy middle ground. Players complained that the card was fundamentally broken by design, either totally useless or too disruptive. Supercell seemed resigned. After May's nerf, Goblin Hut became a low priority, quietly sinking toward statistical obscurity. No further buffs or reworks were hinted at, and no players clamored loudly for its return. Months passed, the card became a ghost in the game's history, quietly forgotten by most. Just when it seemed Goblin Hut was done for good, something unexpected was brewing. After its brutal nerf in 2020, the Goblin Hut spent much of 2021 clawing its way back, but it was never quite a dominant force. Early in the year, things started looking up thanks to buffs given to cards that synergized well with the Hut, namely Elite Barbarians and Mother Witch. Even when those key cards took inevitable nerfs, the Hut didn't completely vanish. It maintained a modest presence. By October of 2021, it hovered around a respectable 5% usage rate, appearing occasionally in certain competitive builds. For the first time in a long while, Goblin Hut looked like it might be settling into a healthy spot. Viable, but not overpowered or annoying. But just as players began to accept this status quo, Supercell hit the Goblin Hut with a surprising change in the final balance update of 2021. They cut its lifetime by 9 seconds, significantly shortening the total number of goblins spawned. But to balance that, they reduced the spawn interval by half a second, speeding up each wave. Alongside those adjustments, its hit points were slashed by a hefty 17.7%, making it far more vulnerable to poison, earthquake, and other area spells. Supercell explained their reasoning. Spawners encouraged a more passive, frustrating style of gameplay. They wanted to discourage stacking buildings during double elixir, which often resulted in stale defensive matches. While the lifetime and spawn interval tweaks felt reasonable, many questioned why the hit point nerf was necessary. It made the Hut painfully fragile, too easy to shut down with popular spells, and it struggled to maintain any foothold in the arena thereafter. As a result, usage rates cratered once more. The Hut re-entered into the shadows, rarely seen in competitive play throughout 2022. Near the end of 2022, Supercell gave the card a fresh spin with a new rework in December. Inspired by a recent Barbarian Hut overhaul, the Goblin Hut was redesigned to spawn goblins in waves of 3 instead of just 1. At the same time, its spawn interval was dramatically increased from 4 to 11.5 seconds, while its lifetime was shortened by 2 seconds. This meant the Hut would spawn 3 waves of 3 goblins each, plus the 3 death goblins upon destruction. The goal, to make the card feel less oppressive by giving opponents brief breaks between waves, improving gameplay flow and reducing frustration. Though the rework didn't transform the Goblin Hut into a meta staple, it did provide a small boost to its viability. It found a niche in certain fireball bait decks and saw some play in minor control strategies, but the momentum was short-lived. One notable deck featuring the Goblin Hut and Mighty Miner saw a surge, but it quickly faded when Mighty Miner received an emergency nerf. In May of 2022, the Goblin Hut still struggled to find a solid place. Its sporadic balancing attempts rarely stuck, and with each tweak seemingly falling short, it felt like the card that was destined to remain a background player, at least for the foreseeable future. But 2023 would bring new winds of change. Before diving into 2023, here is a bit of context. The Spear Goblin troop itself was reworked early in the year, increasing its attack range from 5 to 5.5 tiles. This change was designed to help Spear Goblins more reliably connect with enemy towers and interact more effectively with spirits. What Supercell probably didn't expect was how this seemingly minor tweak would impact the Goblin Hut, the worst performing of the Spear Goblin related cards at the time. The Hut's use rate in Grand Challenges started climbing steadily, eventually reaching around 16%, making it one of the game's top dozen most popular cards. This resurgence was driven partly by a few specific decks, and while the Goblin Hut historically never had any broad deck diversity, it often thrived in just one or two dominant builds. In early 2023, it featured prominently in a Skeleton King Graveyard deck, as well as a somewhat cheeky Goblin Hut mirror deck that exploited synergy between multiple Goblin-related cards. This return to prominence surprised many. After years of being dismissed, the spawner card was once again shaping the meta, a reality some players met with frustration and outright hostility. Social media and forums lit up with calls to nerf or even remove the Goblin Hut entirely. Finally, in June of 2023, Supercell responded with what remains the Goblin Hut's last balance change to date. The Death Goblins it spawns were reduced from 3 to just 1. This nerf brought the Hut's total Goblin output back down to 10, aligning more closely with its earlier, weaker versions. This card seemed to have trouble being relevant for more than just a few weeks, and with this new nerf, it wasn't looking like it would see relevance anytime soon. And well, throughout the rest of 2023, it received no nerfs, buffs, or reworks. So what about 2024? Did the Goblin Hut receive any buffs or a new evolution to bring it back? No, not really. Despite the usual updates and new cards, the Goblin Hut mostly stayed in the shadows. However, it found a rare advantage during the Goblin Queen's Journey event in 2024. In this mode, only Goblin-type cards contributed to filling the Goblin meter. Once you spent 20 elixir worth of Goblin cards, the Goblin Queen would unleash a swarm of baby goblins onto the opponent's side. Because the Goblin Hut continuously spawned Spear Goblins, making it a Goblin-type card, it naturally helped fill the Goblin meter faster than most other cards. This gave it a unique edge in this event, allowing players to trigger the Goblin Queen's Baby Goblin Swarm more reliably. And while this didn't change the Goblin Hut's fate in regular meta, it was a rare moment where the card's identity gave it a clear advantage. And for the remainder of 2024, the Goblin Hut went back to gathering dust. Early in 2025, the Goblin Hut saw a couple of very minor adjustments. On January 8th, the Spear Goblin's first attack time interval was nudged from 0.3 seconds to 0.4, a tiny tweak that likely caused only subtle changes in interactions. Then on March 31st, the Goblin Hut's hit points were decreased by a mere 0.11%. That's so minuscule it feels more like a bug fix or an attempt to correct some inconsistency rather than a deliberate nerf. But just when it seemed like Goblin Hut was still languishing in the shadows, out of nowhere came the most drastic rework the card had ever seen. On May 5th, 2025, Supercell dropped a bombshell update for the Goblin Hut. The elixir cost dropped from 5 to 4, making it more accessible in decks. Hit points shot up by a massive 46%, making the building significantly tougher. Lifetime increased to 30 seconds from 29. The spawn interval between waves was slashed from a whopping 10 seconds down to just 1.7. Each wave now spawned only one Spear Goblin instead of 3. Instead of spawning automatically, Spear Goblins now only appear when an enemy is within range, changing how the card pressures opponents. And finally, the card image and description were completely revamped. The old description, building that spawn Spear Goblins, don't look inside, you don't want to see how they're made, was replaced, signaling a new identity. This rework is a seismic shift, completely redefining how the Goblin Hut functions in the game. The 2025 Goblin Hut rework completely flipped the card's identity on its head. Instead of mindlessly and passively spawning Spear Goblins every couple of seconds, it now behaves like a reactive defensive building. It only sends out goblins whenever enemies get close. This fundamental change makes the Goblin Hut much more of an interactive interactive and engaging card, cutting out the old set it and forget it spawner playstyle that Clash Royale has struggled to balance for nearly a decade. The design team's goal was clear: add a fresh anti-air option alongside staples like Tesla and Evolved Cannon, especially to shake up meta decks that feel forced to rely on just one or two standard defensive buildings. The Goblin Hut's new logic makes it feel more like a traditional defensive building, actively responding to threats rather than just churning out troops regardless of what's happening on the battlefield. This rework was part of a broader design philosophy to move away from spawners encouraging passive AFK playstyles where players camp back and wait. Instead, Clash Royale aims for fast-paced, back-and-forth battles that keep players constantly engaged, and the Goblin Hut's new mechanics reflect that perfectly.
Mortar used to cost 6 elixir, Rage used to not deal damage, Heal Spell became Heal Spirit, but spawners still haven't found their place after 9 or so years. They just don't really make sense in terms of like modern Clash Royale design, you know, where we want like back-and-forth battles and just a lot of engagement. Spawners, just their design is encouraged to like sit back, play behind, and just kind of like AFK. We believe they just have to get redesigned from the ground up to have a place in the game.
Along with the gameplay changes, the Goblin Hut got a complete art refresh, a new card icon, new sprites, signaling this was a fresh start, not just a tweak. It's a nod to the past. Spawners have been around forever, but also a clear step into the future where these types of cards can finally have a meaningful place in modern Clash Royale design. Of course, this isn't the end of the road for spawners. The devs are watching closely and eager to hear from the community how to evolve these cards next, but for now, the Goblin Hut's rework is a bold experiment in transforming a much maligned, underused card into a versatile, dynamic building that feels right at home in today's Clash Royale. It is a rare Supercell W. Even top players are noticing the Goblin Hut's newfound strength. Pro player Riley called it, quote, actually very solid after the recent buff. Not overpowered, but definitely viable.
Probably do notice that we have the Goblin Hut in our deck. Guys, we do have the Goblin Hut here. Goblin Hut is actually very nice after the recent buff that it got. It's actually pretty strong. I don't think it's broken, but it's actually very solid, and it's actually viable right now, which is kind of funny because I didn't think that we'd ever be seeing Goblin Hut in cycle decks, but you know, now we are. I like it quite a bit in this deck. Honestly, I feel like it has some nice spell bait to it, and against a lot of decks, you're able to get really nice value out of your Goblin Hut.
What's actually surprising is seeing the Goblin Hut make a splash in cycle decks, something that seemed unlikely for years. Riley highlighted how the Goblin Hut offers great spell bait potential, which can disrupt opponents and create openings. Against many popular decks, it is delivering strong value by forcing players to deal with its reactive goblins, which adds a fresh layer of strategy to matches. It is a wonderful validation that this rework isn't just a flashy change, but genuinely improves the card's role in competitive play. Seeing the Goblin Hut back in the meta, especially in innovative and new decks, is a sign that spawners might finally have a meaningful place in the game's evolving ecosystem. And as of now, it's sitting at a 10% usage rate and 55% win rate in grand challenges, which is incredibly high. It might even get a nerf with the current motion that it has. I feel like an evolution for the Hut is unlikely, but who knows? Who knows what Supercell might cook up in the future? But speaking of some crazy ideas, what if Clash Royale deleted every air card in the game? The meta would completely collapse. If you haven't seen that video yet, it is a must-watch. You won't believe how broken the game becomes without air units. I can't wait to see you there.